Hey, my name is Dulce, and today I'm going to be going over literature and ancient civilizations. Starting off with the type of research I did, for this I researched the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley Civilization, Greece, and finally Rome. In general, the timeline of these in total spans from around 3500 before the Common Era all the way to around 500 of the Common Era, and I'll be referring to these as just BC and CE. My complex research question states, in what ways did the literary forms and themes of Mesopotamia, Asia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome differ and overlap, and how did their literature reflect the unique characteristics of each civilization? I researched this by firstly researching and learning about each civilization's culture, and after having done that, I researched the literature. My thesis states, although ancient literature from Mesopotamia, Asia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome emerged from distinct cultural and historical contexts, they also shared common motifs such as moral order, authority, and heroism. Through literature, these civilizations preserved their values while also making narratives that reflected the core religious, intellectual, and social values of their societies. Starting with the timelines, I want to start by saying that although these time periods start a little prior to the years 3000 BC, the truth is that there is evidence of these small civilizations just barely starting to emerge from way before that. But for the sake of my topic being based around literature, which didn't occur until way later relative to when civilizations first started to emerge, I'm just going to be starting these timelines off by where these civilizations were starting to reach their peak and were becoming unified civilizations. I made this timeline as a visual reference and explanation of my last slide to demonstrate the time span of these civilizations and how years worked back then. Moving on, since my topic is about literature, I want to go over literature and what it is in general. Now, there are four main types of literature. These would be poetry, fiction, drama, and prose nonfiction. Poetry is expressed in verse. It uses rhythms and associations of sounds, such as in the case of rhyming. Fiction tells a story, and it usually has a plot, along with characters whose actions make up the plot. And drama is very similar to fiction, with a story to tell and a plot, except that it's told through actors who depict the characters of the story. And finally, prose nonfiction. Prose is writing that is not in verse, and so nonfiction prose can be explained as writing based on factual accounts and information. Examples of this can be journalism, such as magazine articles, but it can also be biographies, autobiographies, etc. And while these four categories encompass what literature is, when looking at specific pieces of literature closely, it's sometimes not as well defined as it may seem, because sometimes these categories overlap. Also, it's important to note that while these four categories are now recognized as the categories of literature in general, they did not all appear at once. Rather, these forms evolved over time and were created. And there was even a point in which none of these existed, yet literature came to be through oral storytelling, where these stories were passed down from one generation to the next and preserved as tradition. Before going into its literature, I want to go over Mesopotamia in general. It's considered by archaeologists as one of the places where civilization first began. Mesopotamia was unified by the cultural expression it fostered, and by 3000 BC, it was succeeded by people of diverse ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. And due to this, it had vast cities, where one of its later cities, Babylon, was considered as the center of the civilized world. It's no wonder that it was conquered by Alexander the Great. Some of the cultural values of Mesopotamia were centered around religion, divine order, and the afterlife. This could be seen reflected in their literature too. Being one of the places where civilization first emerged, it's not surprising that it's also considered to be where writing and literature were first created. Writing was first created in the region of Sumer. It was done using a system of writing called cuneiform, which meant wedge-shaped. This was because it was done on clay tablets, and using a reed stylus, it made impressions on the clay tablets, and were then left out to dry in the sun. Cuneiform writing were characters that stood for a certain word. The Sumerians invented it for the purpose of keeping records, but then was used to communicate over long distances. However, once writing was created, it couldn't be stopped, and it developed into works such as poetry, mythology, and prayers. The oldest known surviving work of narrative literature, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, came from Mesopotamia, dating to around 2100 BC. Common themes were about human mortality, gods, and fate, which reflected the belief in divine order and the afterlife. Egypt emerged as a civilization around the year 3000 BC. It had highly fertile lands for which it was famed for its power and wealth. It had many periods, but the most predominant were the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. Egypt had a great military and economic power, but it all came to an end when the Roman Empire conquered and annexed it. Some of their cultural values were about religion. They had deep respect for their gods and the afterlife. They also believed in the divine and fate. As for its literature, since Egypt and Mesopotamia had contact at the time, it's also thought that the concept of writing was borrowed from the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. However, their two writing systems were vastly different in their use of signs, showing that each developed independently. Egypt's system of writing was called hieroglyphics, meaning sacred writing, and for a long time, the Egyptian language was largely undeciphered until the Rosetta Stone, a decree written in 3 different languages: Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Egyptian Demotic script. And since Greek was understood, it allowed for hieroglyphics to be deciphered. These hieroglyphic symbols either represented the objects that they depict or stood for particular sounds or groups of sounds. The first example of Egyptian writing discovered was in the form of offering lists and autobiographies. These were carved into a person's tomb and were to let visitors know what gifts and in what quantities the deceased person was to be given, because their belief was that the dead continued to live spiritually even after their bodies had failed, meaning they still had to eat and drink even if they no longer had a physical form. This reflected their cultural values and their belief in mortality, the afterlife, and the divine. The Indus Valley Civilization in India flourished in the northern region of the Indian subcontinent. One of its largest cities was Harappa. There's evidence of Harappa dating way back to around 7000 BC, but it's said to have emerged around the year 3000 BC because that's when it became more unified as a civilization. However, the civilization fell due to unknown reasons. Many agree that it was due to social decay, and by 1400 BC, its entire society and culture had fallen. Since the Indus Valley Civilization was found relatively not that long ago, little is known about it, and this is also partly because its writing still remains undeciphered. Called the Indus script, it's the writing system developed by the civilization, and it's of the earliest forms of writing known, but it remains undeciphered. No bilingual texts have ever been found, and its connection with other Indian writing systems is uncertain, but we see examples of the writing in pottery, bronze tools, bones, ivory, and other surfaces where its signs are engraved. But even then, this writing is an average length of around 5 signs, and since not much is known about it, its use is not known either. But some examples of the script have been found used on clay tags attached to bundles of goods traded between merchants, or some of these tags have been found in Mesopotamia. Ancient Greece evolved from the Mycenaean civilization and ranged from around 1100 BC to the death of Alexander the Great around 323 BC. The period in which Greece was at its peak left a legacy with influence like no other. Some of their cultural values were based around religion, courage, wisdom, and glory. The Greeks' writing system was called the Greek alphabet, which originated from the Phoenician alphabet, a West Semitic script which the Greeks adopted. They then modified this alphabet by adding their own distinct vowel symbols. It's the earliest known alphabetic script to systematically write vowels as well as consonants. It's a set of 24 letters, and with this alphabet, the Greeks were able to produce some of the most innovative types of literature. They wrote poetry, tragedies, comedy, and philosophy. For example, a lot of their early literature was based on both history and folklore, such as the famous Homer's epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which told tales of war, heroism, and adventure. The Greeks had a rich history of both war and peace, and this was seen in their culture and reflected onto their literature. The period of Rome's civilization started with the founding of Rome in 753 BC, and it became one of the biggest empires, conquering many others such as the Egyptians and the Greeks. However, different parts of Rome ultimately fell to the conquest of others, such as the Germans, and by 476 CE it had fallen. Their cultural values were focused on discipline, legacy, and power, just to name a few. From its beginning, Rome already showed aspects of what would become its literature and cultural values. An example of this was its origin story. To prove noble ancestry, the Romans created legends, one arguing the story of Aeneas, the son of a goddess and a mortal man, who after escaping the sacking of Troy, made his way to Italy and then founded the city of Rome. The other legend is of the story of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers and sons of the god Mars. They were punished and set adrift on the Tiber River, found by a she-wolf, and then raised by a shepherd's family. And once grown, Romulus founded a new city on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC, killed his brother in an argument, and then became the first emperor of Rome. However, these stories were invented to provide a noble ancestry, but archaeologists have found that early Romans were pastoral people. But through these early stories, Rome was already shaping their culture emphasis on aspects such as discipline, legacy, and power. As for their system of writing, it was called the Latin script, and it developed from earlier alphabets such as the Greeks and the Phoenician alphabets and writing systems. Roman literature was greatly characterized by its epic poetry and drama. However, for a lot of their literature, they owe a debt to their neighbors, the Greeks, which they took inspiration from. Much of the literature was adaptations of Greek literature, changed and altered to fit Roman aspects. All these forms of literature can be seen to connect to each other in one way or another. An example of this is how stories unique to each civilization show resemblance to stories of other civilizations. For example, many of these civilizations mentioned have similar stories, and it's largely believed that many of these stories, say for example myths about creation, floods, and epics, were spread by word of mouth by trade and travel, and then were adapted by other civilizations to fit their own culture. Examples of this can be parallels between literature from one civilization to the next, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia and Homer's Odyssey from Greece. Both of these stories share similarities, such as about a journey done by a hero, encounters with divine beings, the search for immortality, and wisdom gained through suffering. And Rome explicitly did this with the Greeks, where they translated Greek works into Latin, renamed them, and then adapted them to reflect Roman values like duty and state loyalty. For example, Virgil's Aeneid was modeled after Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but reshaped to glorify Rome. The storytelling exchange helped shape the shared mythological and literary heritage of the ancient world, even as each civilization made those stories its own by adapting them to express their own worldview. All in all, although ancient literatures from Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, Greece, and Rome emerged from distinct cultural and historical contexts, they also shared common motifs such as moral order, authority, and heroism. Through literature, these civilizations shared and preserved their values, while also making narratives that reflected the core religious and intellectual and social values of their societies.